Gives me great pleasure to introduce Shazia Choudhry. Shazia Choudhry is professor in the Faculty of Law and Hackney Fellow in Law at Wadham College. She was appointed academic fellow of the Inner Temple from 2014 to 2017 and is now an associate academic fellow. She was elected as an academic bencher in 2020. Her research is focused on gender, human rights, and violence against women, and seeks to examine various dimensions of these areas from an interdisciplinary and feminist perspective. In doing so, she employs doctrinal, theoretical, and empirical methods. Her scholarship sits at the interface of criminal law, public law, particularly human rights law, and family law. Welcome, Shazia.
Okay, thanks. And thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks very much for coming. It's particularly pleasing to see so many men coming to hear about patriarchy. So that's a good start. So I'm just going to start with a kind of overview, really, of the project. I'm assuming that not everyone has had an opportunity to read it in detail. It was quite a lot of information. So I'm just going to go through really a summary of the actual project, which I'm going to attempt to theorize. It is very much a work in progress, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback actually on it. So that'll be really good. So starting with just the project, you can see the project that was actually called Everyday Resilience and Gender Justice in Rural Urban India. And it was funded by the British Academy. And I don't know if you can see that, but there were 3 teams. I just want to go over the project a bit because it's really important. It was a multidisciplinary team as well. So we had a geographer in London, myself, a lawyer. We also had political scientists in India, anthropologists, and another lawyer, and a couple of sociologists. So it was very multidisciplinary as a team. We chose 3 areas in India, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal to look at. What's the study about? Well, essentially, it was about looking at the effectiveness of this piece of legislation, which is the main piece of legislation in India, which seeks to protect women from domestic violence. And as it says there, 18 years after the passage of this, recourse to formal mechanisms of support, security, and justice, which envisaged by this act are still lacking, uneven, or even out of reach for most women survivors. And what we wanted to do is examine the ongoing obstacles which are clearly there to realising the legal provisions and services that were contained in this act. And survival was a theme, and resilience was a theme, particularly the themes that the British Academy wanted to fund as well in this particular area of the world. So we're looking at resilience within the context of domestic abuse, which is clearly relevant. Research aims were centering the experiences of domestic violence victim-survivors. And we aim to understand, first of all, how survivors of domestic abuse navigate or manage the day-to-day realities of abuse in the absence of access to services and legal provision. Secondly, how survivors of domestic violence access support and legal services, and to what extent, in what ways, and what kinds of services. And thirdly, the possible structural, institutional, and cultural factors that impede or enable access to services and legal provision and inform the environments within which DV endures. And those are kind of very multidisciplinary aims, and it's a huge project. And this is just a tiny part of it that I was very interested in. In fact, when we were planning the questions for the survivors, the rest of the team, it's a lot of it on Zoom, because this project happened during COVID. The rest of the partners would say things like, oh, this is Shazia's question, because it was about justice or something. So, so this is just a very, very small part of the project that I'm kind of concentrating on today, but you can see it's quite large. And here are 3 maps, sorry. Here's 3 maps of where we were looking at in India. And as you can see, it's a rural-urban divide that we were looking at as well. So we looked at urban places, semi-urban places, and also rural places in terms of who we interviewed and who we studied. The research methods involved mapping, which was basically producing a up-to-date database of organisations that support women, which actually in a lot of the areas just hadn't happened for a long time. So in itself, the project enabled that to happen. I should also add that this was an academic and civil society research initiative as well. So we partnered with NGOs in India as well. So it was a partnership in that sense. And we undertook qualitative interviews with survivors, 180 of them, which is a huge amount. in hindsight, probably too many, but anyway, with survivors of domestic violence, which represented the heart of the project, as it says there. In each site, those 3 areas, research teams interviewed at least 20 survivors of domestic violence, 60 across the state, and 100 interviews across all 3 states. We also undertook interviews with local stakeholders, which are lawyers, medical practitioners, NGO workers, police, and protection officers. And there's 180 of those, and there were at least 12 participants from each of those categories. And finally, we also interviewed community members. 90 semi-structured interviews with community members were conducted across rural, semi-urban and urban sites to sort of understand what the kind of wider community understandings were of first of all, the Act, but domestic violence in general. And they were really interesting and revealing too. So we didn't just go for the normal kind of actors within the justice system. We were also really interested in, given it's domestic abuse, what do community members think about this issue? What do they know about it? And then finally, the photography, which you'll see in some of the slides. We commissioned 3 photographers to represent survivors in everyday contexts of domestic abuse. We were quite keen to be able, there's an open access page, which I'll talk about at the end. I wrote the part in the project about the law and ideas of justice. And this is the first thing I just wanted to summarize. From the interviews with across the board in terms of all those stakeholders, there were understands of justice that were beyond the prevailing formal system of justice, and they included retributive, distributive, economic justice, peacemaking, and relational. Ideas of justice and the law among survivors with respect to their perceived rights and how they would like their situation to be resolved were highly contextual, as you can imagine. They were also contradictory, which isn't a surprise when it comes to domestic abuse survivors as well, because they often want the relationship to continue, for example. They just want the violence to stop, and that's obviously not very doesn't really work very well in the system of justice that we have. And they also evolved over time as their experiences shifted and they engaged with different stakeholders. That was very clear. And at a basic level, awareness of law or legal remedies was absent or incomplete among survivors, and there was hardly any awareness of legal rights. Intergenerational cycles of patriarchy resulted in most of the survivors not being able to recognise themselves, indeed, as rights-bearing individuals, which I think was particularly concerning, or was for me anyway. We also found a difference in terms of class. We didn't really go into caste too much. We tried to have a very intersectional approach to the people that we interview, but it didn't really quite work out. Sometimes statistically it wasn't enough. But what we did find is that educated middle-class urban women were more likely to talk about a thicker and a more expansive conception of rights. However, less educated women from lower socioeconomic groups in rural and semi-urban spaces harboured a thinner a more basic conception of rights. So they often talked about their rights in terms of, very sort of basic kind of, my right to economic sustenance, etc. Can I go out even, etc. Whereas the women that we spoke to in the middle class urban areas are talking about very kind of different restrictions on their freedom, being able to have friends and what they were wearing, etc. And then finally, interviews of survivors from marginalised communities such as the disabled, LGBTQ and migrant women revealed a lack of awareness of their legal rights and a lack of faith, moreover, that rights were either enforceable or indeed applicable to them as a group. So where there was awareness of legal rights amongst marginalised groups, it was much worse in terms of, well, they just didn't have any faith that they even existed. So that was obviously problematic. And then I split the analysis into a number of areas in terms of seeking justice. So firstly, seeking justice through the community. And what we found is that the family was often the first point of call, which is probably what you would imagine in most cases, which usually resulted, however, in attempts at mediation. Mediation meaning going back to the relationship. And these proved largely unsuccessful. And after this, or in parallel, survivors looked at other organisations within the community, which I'll talk about next. So quasi-judicial remedies and also judicial remedies, going to law enforcement, etc. And it was not uncommon for women to weave between these, in some cases with the support from family members or faith-based organisations. Faith also provided an important source of hope for some survivors outside of the realms of worldly justice, as one of the survivors put it. So it was quite a nice way of talking about it, really. And community justice mechanisms rarely questioned or challenged inherently the unequal power relations and endemic violence which occurred, taking a predominantly mediatory role. And community justice mechanisms also rarely worked and failed to provide any follow-up or enforcement of any mediated outcomes, despite all of that, that's usually the first place that women turn to. So you can see it's obviously not a very effective remedy. And then we see seeking justice through quasi-legal bodies. So these are institutions such as the panchayats, which is, how can I describe this, a sort of village elder type situation. And within India, they have, depending on where they are, they have a sort of formal role within the institution. You're nodding, it sounds like you might know what I'm talking about. But they sort of have a kind of formal role as well in some districts. Where they are actually supposed to undertake this role, but not, I think, within the realms of domestic violence. That's not what they're supposed to do. It's usually kind of civil matters that are going on in the village, but they take on this role in relation to domestic abuse as well. And also they were called clubs, community clubs as well, where people meet. So there were lots of kind of different ways that we found these sort of quasi-legal institutions, and NGOs were often approached in parallel to and as a consequence of other informal and formal attempts at mediation and justice. Panchayats were also approached by many survivors in rural and semi-urban locations, despite having no formal role in such matters. And again, survivors had overwhelmingly negative experiences with panchayats. And that's largely because they were embedded in social structure, they failed to question and often replicated the fundamental and societal hierarchies of power, and were prone to the maintenance of the family as an institution. There's lots of quotes in the paper that I sent out which demonstrate that. And their mediation, crucially, never touched on the inherent violent nature of the domestic, but was geared towards finding manageable, even if temporary, solutions. So they were there to maintain the status quo effectively. But the point is the survivors didn't know that. And they went to them with some hope that there was going to be some kind of resolution on their behalf. I mean, sometimes they did, but most of the time they did not. NGOs also played a crucial role in terms of providing support to survivors, although they often went further, such as helping women to file legal proceedings or to persuade the police to become involved. They also liaised with lawyers on their behalf, and survivors overwhelmingly had positive experiences of engagement with NGOs as a result. Although I think that's largely because of the self-selective sample we had. We often recruited survivors for the study through NGOs. So I think they were probably going to have a really positive experience. It's quite difficult to find survivors that didn't, but there were some who community members talked in negative terms about NGOs rather than the survivors themselves that we spoke to. And NGOs also supported women in pursuing community-based justice mechanisms as a pragmatic and often quicker response, because the law in India, unfortunately, is an inefficient and cumbersome legal process. There was, however, an awareness among some of them of the dangers of relying on community-based mechanisms alone. So there were some NGOs who had just completely parted company, for example, in terms of cooperating with panchayats, because they just felt they were very unsafe mechanisms to collaborate with, because in one case, a few women had actually died because of the panchayat's resolution had gone back and then had been killed. So some NGOs are very clear that they were just not going to work with those kind of bodies anymore. And then seeking justice through the law, again, largely negative. The experiences of the police were pretty bad. Allegations of corruption, taking an inappropriate role in mediating between couples. It was quite clear that police officers thought their role was really to mediate at the police station. Again, to maintain the status quo and just to sort of, put the couple into a room and do this sort of informal mediation process. There was also a clear failure to take any action. There was also lots of evidence of a lack of sensitivity towards victims of gender-based violence, and particularly those in marginalised communities. And there was also an evidence of a culture of disbelief towards victims. Quite prevalent in terms of all the justice actors that we spoke to was this idea that the law was being misused by women, which I think is some kind of propaganda going on in the general sort of sphere and sort of public sphere about women lying. It's a bit like rape myths. This is sort of domestic abuse myths going on, which is women just lie because they're trying to, I don't know, get a divorce, or they're trying to obtain a financial settlement. So this was very prevalent as well. There were some positive aspects to the policing, and one of these was the women police officers and the specially trained domestic violence protection officers that were envisaged in the Act. Where they were present, they were actually quite good. But again, a question of resources, there weren't enough. There was some evidence of the police engaging in behaviour that appeared to be a deterrent to some perpetrators. And some evidence that the mediatory role had some positive effect for some survivors, because some survivors wanted the police to undertake this mediatory role. They didn't actually want them to enforce the law. They wanted them to mediate. And the experiences of special women's cells were also largely positive. We also found that protection officers had significant challenges which made carrying out their duties very difficult. So there's clearly a resource problem in terms of resourcing this type of justice, a lack of personnel, insufficient resources in general, and insufficient levels of reward for this, pretty terrible job, really, and not being paid very much money for it at all. However, despite all of that, survivors often had very positive experiences of these specially trained protection officers. Lawyers. Experiences were mixed, and there were several themes that emerged, unfortunately, around corruption, a lack of sensitivity towards survivors of violence, and evidence of a widespread belief in the misuse of law by lawyers themselves, who didn't think that the survivors were really telling the truth, or they were exaggerating what was going on. So where we did see positive evidence in terms of lawyers was those lawyers who were specialised in this kind of work, who really understood the dynamics of domestic abuse and also the wider cultural issues and barriers for women in this situation. And in terms of the courts and the judicial system, well, again, pretty poor, significant issues in terms of delays in court proceedings, inconsistencies and problems with the procedures for obtaining maintenance. I mean, obviously, when it comes to a survivor of domestic abuse, it's not just the abuse that you need to deal with. You need to deal with the family side of things, the financial side of things, as well as any kind of sort of public law interest in the children too. Lots of delays and a very understaffed and overstretched judiciary. And again, a lack of sensitivity towards survivors among some members of the judiciary. We undertook this project during COVID, which was another significant methodological challenge, which I'm happy to talk about later. And what we found is these problems were further exacerbated with marginalised survivors who faced additional barriers on top of everything else in terms of their marginalised status. So if they were migrants, the three main groups that we found in our project were migrant women, women from LGBT communities, and also disabled women. They were sort of more represented in terms of numbers. And then that's it in terms of the summary of what I want to talk about. And I'm going to leave this really open. I probably haven't spoken very long, but I'm much more interested in a discussion really about it. But so kind of points of theorization. So there's a lot of data. There's a lot of detail in the actual paper and the report that we prepared as well. And I was thinking a lot about how do I theorize this? Because, and I just kept coming back to, well, this is just patriarchy, isn't it? So, what's interesting about that? We all know about patriarchy, but then actually, thinking about it a bit more, and I've been working in domestic violence now for years and years and years, I realized that a lot of the literature in the last 10 years or so has really not been talking about patriarchy enough, which is why I titled the paper Paying Attention to Patriarchy. What we're increasingly doing, those who work in this area, is to talk about either individualized experiences of violence against women in general, or domestic abuse, so kind of coercive control that happens in an individual relationship. Or there's lots of literature on, necessarily focused actually on emerging ways in which violence can be committed against women. So image-based sexual abuse is obviously one of them. Now we're talking about AI and how AI facilitates abuse against women. There's lots of nice new emerging ways of doing it. So it's the more technology we have, the more ways that we can further abuse women. So there's lots of necessary, work in that area. And I think what patriarchy has kind of dropped off a theoretical agenda a bit, because it seems like I did at the beginning when I was looking at this, well, it's obvious it's patriarchy. And because I kept thinking about it, I was doing lots of reading and came across Sally Hanslanger's piece and her discussion with Robin Denbrough about what patriarchy is and this sort of in terms of systems of patriarchy. They were talking about unjust social systems in general. And that's what I kind of came to. So that's kind of my sort of framing really in terms of let's re-look at patriarchy. Let's remind ourselves what patriarchy actually is. And as you can see there's one definition: a system of social structures and practices in which men dominate, oppress, and exploit women. And we know that whilst these structures can be seen in the larger society, they're also seen in the familial unit, in which patriarchal tradition, practices, and ideals are vertically transmitted from generation to generation. And that is pretty much clear from the project. In the communities we looked at in India, patriarchy is very much alive and well, and very much fits within that definition. We also know that patriarchy constitutes an unjust social system. And using Haslanger's definition, a network of events and causal relations between them that produce systemic wrongs and harms, including entrenched patterns of oppression and domination. And again, that much is pretty clear from the project findings as well. But why do we need to look at patriarchy? I think it's important, as Denbrough has argued, to identify the essential ideology of it as an unjust social system. That's why we're interested in it. So it's not just because we're feminists and we're interested in patriarchy, it's actually because it's an unjust social system and the crucial role that it plays, therefore, with respect to domestic abuse. And she argues that we need to identify patriarchy as an unjust social system because then it allows us to for it to do its vital explanatory work, as she terms it, in terms of predicting, identifying and explaining various patterns of wrongful treatment and patterns that track, she says, particular features, and to therefore accurately determine what kinds of actions or policies will most effectively change those patterns in the future. So rather than concentrating on individual experiences that women have of domestic abuse, or rather than concentrating on how we can address new and emerging forms of violence, which is what we're doing increasingly, and what laws we need to pass, actually we need to kind of look at the sort of meta level analysis of what's actually causing this. And in this sense, looking at patriarchy again as the sort of, major sort of framing that happens across contexts, across history and across cultures. It's a high level descriptor, but it's really important to have that high level descriptor if we're going to actually affect societal change and try to make this unjust system a bit better as much as we can. So that's my argument, basically, which I've just written about, why I want to pay attention to patriarchy. It's fallen off the theoretical agenda. Here are the two shifts, and I think we need to shift back. So we need to look at that in a bit more detail. And then looking back at the data with that in mind, I've got some other points of theorization that I'd love to hear your feedback on. First of all, the idea, this notion of patriarchal risk. What I've been doing is actually going back and looking at some very old material for me anyway, in domestic abuse, because we've been writing about patriarchy and domestic abuse forever and within feminist legal theory. But what's been super interesting is going back to looking at things that, that were written in the 1980s or whatever. It is actually really illuminating. So patriarchal risk came from actually an anthropologist called Kane back in the 1970s, who was actually writing about Bangladesh at the time. But the argument goes, and this is how I want to use it, what's going on in terms of survivors, family, friends, and community. We can see patriarchal risk being managed by these actors or institutions within Indian society, I think, to manage the patriarchal risk. And the patriarchal risk, as Kane defines it, is the dependence on men for economic needs and social protection leaves women particularly vulnerable to this. And so the risks and uncertainties attendant on women's dependent status within such as paradoxically engenders in them greater incentives to comply with it rather than challenge male dominance and to manipulate the norms of male obligation and protection to shore up their own position with their families. So, for example, the example he uses is in Bangladesh, in a very rural location, that women would, particularly widows, for example, would ensure their male offspring. They had to make sure that the male offspring, they had a very good relationship with the male offspring, to the detriment often of their relationship with their daughter-in-law, because the man was going to keep them safe, was going to provide for them, etc. And kind of, arranging marriages in order to secure land, etc., etc. So you're basically effectively managing patriarchal risk, even though you're actually a woman and you're not benefiting from it. But what you're doing is you understand that the society that you're in doesn't really give you any choices. So you have these sort of constrained choices that you make within the context of patriarchy. And therefore your lives are basically spent managing patriarchal risk. And I think that was kind of what was going on a little bit with the data, in terms of those who are doing it, I think, from kind of good faith, benevolent reasons. Some are obviously doing it for bad faith reasons, as we know. And then the other concept is patriarchal bargaining, which is Candiotti, writing in 1988, talking about how women strategize within a set of concrete constraints. I think this builds on what's been really interesting about this reading, just as an aside, is how when you do multidisciplinary work, actually how scary it is, because you realize people are talking about concepts at the same time in different ways, And it's who wrote what, when, where, and what does it mean even. But you can see that they're all building on, essentially the same idea really. But so it's women strategize with a set of concrete constraints that reveal and define the blueprint of the patriarchal bargain of any given society, which may exhibit variations according to class, caste, and ethnicity. And then obviously in my example, there's lots of other things going on, disability and also minority rights in general. And she argues that these patriarchal bargains exert a powerful influence on the shaping of women's gender subjectivity and determine the nature of gender ideology in different contexts. So women understand the constraints they're in. They know that, and they bargain in terms of they have trade-offs. So they may not leave a relationship until they reach a certain threshold because they realize that if they left the relationship because of the wider patriarchy, they won't be able to survive. Right. So it has to be a particular threshold, which is something we found in our data as well, that women only leave when a particular threshold has been reached, i.e. it becomes incredibly dangerous for them to stay, or something like the children are being affected, that kind of thing. So in effect, there's a trade-off. They're actually aware of what's going on. So that's a kind of different idea. And I think that's probably directed more towards survivors, kind of engaging in patriarchal bargaining. And to a certain extent, family members on their behalf as well, right? They're doing the patriarchal bargaining as well. So they use these words such as the word adjust came up quite a lot in a lot of the interviews from family members, and also from justice actors saying things like, you just have to adjust. So a woman would experience domestic abuse early on in the relationship. She would go to the police, she would go to her family or community members or whatever. And the word that often was used is you have to adjust. And I was trying to work out what work is this word adjust doing, which I'll come back to in a minute. But one of the things it's doing is it's really, I think, in terms of wider family members, it's almost a sort of bargain that they're doing. So, try and go back, try and make it work, or try to adjust. I think just bear it as long as you can, because the consequences for you of leaving this relationship outside in the wider patriarchal society are too high. I think that's what that's doing too. And then adaptive preferences, which I'm sure some of you have come across already, but this idea that women who adapt their preferences to unjust conditions lack the psychic capacities that would allow them to develop their own normative perspectives and or form appropriate values. It's what's called false consciousness within radical feminism and within philosophy is called adaptive preferences. This has been seen as morally problematic because it could, or it does have the potential to perpetuate colonial stereotypes about women from the global south in particular as being unable to exercise their own autonomy, etc. However, it is possible to use a conception of adaptive preferences as advanced by Serene Kheder, which is consistent with acknowledging agency in women who, on the face of it, perpetuating their oppression. And here I'm talking about the mothers and the community members, etc., and family members who are saying, go back into the relationship. And even to a certain extent, survivors themselves, right? And she has this conception of adaptive preferences, which are incompatible with an agent's basic well-being, but are formed under unjust conditions, and that agent would reverse upon exposure to better conditions. So that's a way of explaining some of the choices that are made by survivors themselves and also by family members on their behalf. And to a certain extent, sometimes the police officers, sometimes the panchayats, right? They're trying to sort of help them out in some way. And then justice actors, when I came to them thinking, what are they doing? So I kept thinking about this quite a lot. I don't know if you know Timothy Endicott, but Timothy Endicott and I had a really good chat about this. I was thinking, Timothy, I just can't, I'm trying to find a term that will sort of describe what's going on, because so the adaptive preferences, the patriarchal risk, the patriarchal bargaining, that all works for the people who are doing it on behalf of the women. But actually, what about the women who want to leave? And there were most of the survivors that we spoke to recognized the injustice that they experienced, recognized that what was happening to them was a wrong that was being committed, actually wanted to leave the relationship, often talked about wanting to find a livelihood. So they knew that their way out was financial independence, to get a livelihood, etc. And they were going to all these different actors within the system to try to break free from this relationship or to try to achieve some sense of justice. And I say in one of my conclusions in the report is that, it felt like justice just became this mythical beast. They were just chasing this thing that didn't really exist. And it was really a question of luck, really, if they came across somebody who was, a police officer that was trained enough and had the right resources, a judge that was sympathetic, a lawyer that understood, etc., or an NGO that was particularly well placed to help them. But it really was just a question of luck. But there was also something, I think, quite active going on as well, which is obstructing. So I talked earlier about, in the kind of benign sense, you might think those who are approaching these women in good faith, thinking, well, this is, they're negotiating the patriarchy on their behalf and the risks that are attached to it. But there were also other actors who were clearly, I think, acting in bad faith. And that's why I came up with this idea of patriarchal forestalling. And it was Timothy who came up with the idea of forestalling. Because that forestalling means to prevent or obstruct by taking advance action. And I think for some of these justice actors, that's what they were doing. They were actually stopping justice from happening in relation to these women. And I'm not sure it was always because of this sort of benign sense of, sort of benevolence towards these women and thinking about what's going to happen to them. And that kind of, this is very incomplete, but this kind of works with the idea, therefore, and obviously they represent the state, the justice actors. So in terms of human rights, the state has a responsibility, a positive duty to help victims of domestic abuse. And in that sense, we can see that the state is not a passive or neutral actor in the failure to implement the PWDVA and tackle domestic violence, but actually it can be understood as an agent of domestic violence in itself, in terms of the patriarchal forestalling that's happening. Therefore, it becomes a state crime. And there has been lots of state crime analysis of domestic abuse, but I think it's quite I haven't really developed that point yet, but I think I'm more interested in just describing the what's going on in terms of the patriarchal forestalling. But that's something that could happen, I guess, in the paper. So all in all, this allows, I think, I argue, for a feminist reframing of the relationship between the state and domestic violence. It centres the political and uneven power relations, and understands domestic violence within wider experiences of harm emanating from multiple sources and sites, but fundamentally paying attention to patriarchy. That's it.
Thank you.